Paul Cotter, thank you so much for joining me and as one of our Skate Ontario spotlights. It's so good to see you.
Fantastic. Great to be here, PJ.
You and I have spent more than a couple of events sitting, side by side, not necessarily always as announcers, but we're both announcers. We usually cross paths over events. But how long have you been actually, I like to call them stadium announcers?
I have been doing this for, believe it or not, 35 years. It all started back at the Scarborough Figure Skating Club where my daughter was skating at the time. And not to be one to sit along the sideboards, listening to everybody else yakking. I really wanted to get involved. And so I ended up in getting involved administratively. And then one year at a club competition, they needed some help and said, could you possibly do this? Well, I'll give it a try. Don't have any training, but that's where it all began. And here we are today.
It's so funny about announcing. I don't know of a school for announcers. It seems like many of us, myself included, just kind of think, what, I could probably do that. I'm going to give that a shot. And the worst thing that happens is that you only do one competition. And the best thing that happens is that you get to travel the country back and forth, meeting with friends, and just watching a sport that you obviously came to know as a dad, but you've come to realize so many things about the sport in your own right. So tell me some of the best things that you've learned as a result of being involved in figure skating.
I think just the whole volunteer aspect, and skating in Ontario was built on volunteers. And you had an opportunity to work with people who were involved for the right reasons. They were involved because they wanted to be there. They weren't paid to be there, but they wanted to be there. And they wanted to do the very best for the skating community. And I think that was probably the biggest single attraction. And you had some very, very competent, capable people who wanted to give their very best all the time.
You know what's so wonderful about the period of time in which you've been announcing? There have been some true legends that have glided across the rink in front of you. Are there any performances or any competitions that sort of jump to mind as highlights for you?
Well, it's interesting. After announcing, I figured somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 competitions, a staggering number over those 35 years. It's very difficult to think of, very specific ones, but a couple come to mind. And the first one being, it was a Special Olympics competition here in Ontario. And in this particular event, there were two boys. On the warm-up, one of them fell and hurt himself. And they had to help him off the ice. Of course, he was upset. He was crying. The other skater left the ice with him. And he sat in the players' bench while the warm-up was still on. And he would not come back to the ice to finish warm-up or compete until he was guaranteed that his friend was going to be able to skate as well. So it was that evidence of true sportsmanship that shone through. And that's just at a sort of at the lower end of skating. Probably the big highlight from a international type of event was 2007 World Synchronized Skating Championships in London, Ontario. And that event had about 14,000 fans. The place was absolutely thunderous. The building absolutely shook. It was just an unbelievable experience. Those are just a couple that come to mind.
You know what? I remember that synchronized skating competition. And I remember, I think I saw you in the back hallway and I said, it didn't really matter what you said because nobody could hear you anyway over the cheering.
It was an unbelievable experience.
It sure was. Can you tell me a little bit about the relationships and what being an announcer at figure skating competitions has added to your life?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I think it's just the giving part. It's extremely gratifying when people recognize you. They appreciate the volunteerism. They appreciate the effort. I've always taken great pride in treating all skaters equally. I've always believed that every skater that steps on the ice, it's an Olympic moment for that skater, regardless of whether they're a can skater or whether they're an international competitor. And it's the fact that they appreciate that we put in the time, the effort, the planning, the training, the preparation for those events. And they're extremely, extremely grateful. I've often heard the words, "Oh, this guy is the voice of skating," and it's extremely flattering. Hardly necessarily the truth, but it's certainly a very flattering thing. But it's extremely satisfying to know that skaters, coaches, volunteers appreciate the effort you put out.
And you know what? I don't know an announcer that works harder than you do, as far as the preparation, as far as making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And from the outside, I mean, some people just think of us as read alouders. And yeah, we read aloud. But honestly, there's a lot more to it. Did you ever let the pressure get to you? Did it ever feel overwhelming?
Um, I think there's always the jitters, the nerves, etc. And when you slide into that chair, particularly at an international event, and you're always intimidated by the situation and hope you never make a mistake. And of course, sitting beside you, perhaps is the infamous Peter Crick from the ISU, and we've both had the opportunity of working with Peter, and truly a very, very demanding individual. But it was interesting because he always brought out the best in everybody, and he ensured that you arrived prepared and ready to go to work.
So I have sort of another little question. And yes, Peter, we love you if you're watching, that's for sure. I just
Great
kind of
guy.
want to know. Yeah, absolutely. And some of the funniest stories in skating have come
Mhm.
from Mr. Crick, I'll tell you. I want to know from you, if somebody is watching this and they're interested in becoming an announcer, is there a clear pathway?
Well, it's interesting because I have certainly over the course of the years, I have trained I don't know how many different people. I've conducted training courses in several provinces. I've over the course of the last 10 years, I've also conducted several webinars in Skate Ontario back in the 17, 18, 19 timeframe. Unfortunately, COVID came along.
Yeah.
And so it was a great introduction for and opportunities for skaters, coaches, volunteers of any kind to get involved and to be an announcer. And once participating in that kind of a webinar type of activity, then I really encourage them to try to get involved even at the local club level for little star 1 to 4 competitions, etc. Just get out there, get practicing, and stay in contact with your local club, stay in contact with the section of your interest. It's there. The opportunities are there.
I want to know. So, Scarborough Skate back in the days where you got your start. Scarborough competition is where it all sort of closes up. Last event. Tell me about that.
Well, that was just the last 3 days.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. The club, of course, has been extremely supportive and appreciative of mine and Judy's efforts over the last 35 years. And it was really quite amazing. The committee was extremely gracious, grateful, presented me with a wonderful recognition, and we're going to continue that on. But the Scarborough Skate of this year was very different than those of yesteryear, in that this was a bring on the fun competition. It was 900 skates. It was on Sunday. We had, I don't know how many hundred skaters involved in team elements, absolute chaos on the ice, but a huge amount of fun. The joy, the smiles, the excitement of the kids to be back on the ice, absolutely amazing. And I was literally shocked at the number of skaters and coaches who, once they had heard I was hanging up the microphone, came over, gave me a big hug, and were extremely appreciable of everything I've done, and expressed their regret that I was leaving.
Do you know what? We all feel that way for sure. Do you have anything that you can say about volunteerism? As we started off this conversation, it is the backbone of our sport. Is there anything that you can say about having been a volunteer for all of these many years?
Well, volunteerism in skating, certainly in particular, the sport was built on volunteers. If we look back at in Ontario, the sections that we had 50 plus volunteer board members who were very actively involved in the operations and organization of the sport on a continuous day-to-day basis. Now, in 2017, we kind of flipped the charge and we formed Skate Ontario in effect, and we consolidated those sections all at that time. Unfortunately, we may have lost our way a little bit with respect to the appreciation and the usage of volunteers. And I really am hopeful and optimistic that Skate Ontario is going to get back on track, and they're going to more actively involve the volunteer community, because unfortunately, there's a huge number of very highly skilled and trained volunteers out there that are not being taken advantage of. And I think if we can learn to recognize that they can make a huge contribution, if we simply acknowledge them, treat them with respect, treat them as partners in trying to grow the sport, in trying to administer the sport, etc. I think it'll make an absolutely huge difference on a go-forward basis. And it kind of takes us back to our roots in how this sport was organized and grew over the last 50 or 100 years.
You know what, Paul Cotter, it is an absolute treat to talk to you. And we want to just say thank you so much for all of it and for being one of our spotlights. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much.